In the spring of 2016, an 18-year-old inmate named Jalen Harper arrived at the Millstone County Correctional Facility in Mississippi. His sentence was 8 years, handed down after he was caught with a distribution-level quantity of narcotics. It was his first offense, but the amount, combined with digital evidence from his phone, had sealed the case. He had no priors, no gang affiliations, and no reputation. Until that moment, Jalen's life had been split between urban neglect and artistic obsession. In the neglected neighborhoods of Jackson, he had made a name for himself as a street artist. His spray-painted murals, though often illegal, carried a style that hinted at raw talent. Teachers had urged him to apply to art school, but drugs paid faster than scholarships, and one night in a parked car changed everything. Millstone was not built for redemption. It was a gray, overpopulated structure with rusted fencing and fluorescent lights that never truly shut off. From the moment Jalen stepped off the transport bus, dressed in state-issued brown and shackled at the wrists, he felt the gaze of men who had been locked away for decades. Some watched out of boredom. Others with intent. Intake processed him in silence. He was handed his bedroll, his ID tag, and a handbook of rules few actually followed. Then he was led to D-Block, a wing known for housing long-term inmates and those considered stable but dominant. His cell was narrow, lined with flaking paint and the faint smell of mildew. His cellmate was an older man who neither spoke nor moved much beyond the routine of existence. Jalen placed his things quietly and tried to disappear into the background. But youth stood out. Slim, nervous, and clearly new, he was a beacon to those who hunted the vulnerable. That same night, 2 men from another cell entered under the pretense of introductions. What followed was brutal. Jalen didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply endured, frozen by disbelief and shame. The assault left him physically damaged and mentally paralyzed. By morning, he could hardly move. A guard noticed the blood and swelling and sent him to the infirmary. There, a nurse documented injuries consistent with sexual violence, though no formal complaint was filed. That, too, was routine. In the infirmary, behind a curtain stained with iodine and time, he came into the view of Luther Scott. Luther was nearing his 50th birthday and had already served 18 years on a 25-year sentence for armed robbery and manslaughter. He walked with the calm authority of someone who had survived the full spectrum of prison life and emerged as something more than feared, respected. He had seen Jalen before, from a distance, noting the fragile way he moved and the way others hovered around him. Now, seeing the aftermath firsthand, Luther made a decision. By the time Jalen was wheeled back into D-Block, the hierarchy had shifted. Word spread that Jalen was no longer untouchable, he was claimed. Luther didn't need to explain. A nod, a glance, a single message whispered down the tiers was enough. From that day forward, no one laid a hand on Jalen without permission. His bruises faded. His ribs healed. But the weight of survival came at a cost. Protection was currency, and Jalen had become a possession within invisible boundaries. He owed his life, but what he gave in return would take more than time. He had entered prison as a number in the system, but now he was something else entirely, someone shaped not by justice, but by the unspoken rules of captivity. Jalen's hands had always moved with precision, even before prison, when they held spray cans instead of ink needles, when they painted under bridges instead of cell walls. In Millstone, that same precision reemerged in the form of sketches. At first, he drew on scraps of paper salvaged from commissary receipts and old paperback covers. Faces, hands, wings, wounds, his pencil seemed to channel something that transcended confinement. Fellow inmates noticed. So did the guards. There was something arresting in his lines, something personal, raw, and unsettlingly beautiful. Luther observed quietly, recognizing the change. He handed Jalen a bundle of parts smuggled through exchanges, small motors from electric razors, bent paperclips, ink from pens, the shell of an old lighter. Jalen spent days assembling them in silence. By the end of the week, he had built a crude but functional tattoo machine. It buzzed faintly, erratic in rhythm but strong enough to carry ink beneath the skin. Luther offered his chest for the first test, a portrait of his mother, long dead, remembered through a single faded photograph. Jalen worked with care, moving the needle like a painter with a brush. The portrait emerged slowly, layer by layer, beneath layers of scarred skin. When it was done, even Luther fell silent. The likeness was uncanny. It wasn't just ink, it was memory reborn through pain. Word spread fast. Requests flooded in from all sides of the block. Men who once sneered now begged for sessions. Guards whispered about the kid who could paint in skin. A waiting list formed, enforced unofficially by Luther's reach and the fear he commanded. Jalen tattooed shoulders, backs, arms, and chests. He inked tears beneath eyes, names of dead brothers, prayers to gods no one spoke of aloud. Every piece told a story, and every story made Jalen more indispensable. He became known simply as the artist. His work became currency. Cigarettes, snacks, stamps, drugs, even protection, everything flowed upward to Luther, who managed Jalen's schedule like a businessman counting profit. Jalen received none of it. At most, he got clean towels, the occasional double portion of dinner, and the unspoken assurance that no one would touch him without consequence. But inside, Jalen remained hollow. His hands moved with grace, but his mind churned with silence. The cell walls became narrower. The faces blurred. Tattoo after tattoo, session after session, he sank deeper into a kind of mechanical numbness. Then came the routine checkup. The clinic nurse said little, but her eyes didn't lie. A week later, the results returned. Positive. HIV. He had been infected. No names were given. No speculation offered. But Jalen knew. He could trace the violence, the blood, the night of silence when his body stopped belonging to him. His face paled. For the first time since the assault, he looked lost again. But he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't say a word. That night, he sat in his cell, unmoving, as the light flickered above. The infection wasn't just in his blood. It spread to his thoughts, curling around his memory like smoke. He saw the faces of those who had lined up to be tattooed. He saw how they looked at him, with admiration, with reverence. He thought of the machine, the needle, the ink. And he realized he had become something more than a victim. Something more dangerous. The boy who once painted to escape had found a new canvas, and with it, a new purpose. Jalen kept working. From the outside, little had changed. He showed up to every session, quiet and focused, machine in hand. But his eyes were different now, hollow, distant, sharpened by a private fire. His tattoos evolved. They were no longer mere images but riddles wrapped in myth, symbols layered with meaning only he fully understood. Snakes eating their tails, angels with broken wings, suns cracked down the middle. The inmates who lined up for his work claimed they saw pieces of their own stories in the ink. They called it spiritual, even redemptive. But Jalen saw something else entirely. He saw bodies marked for sacrifice. Before each session, he performed a ritual. Alone, in his makeshift corner of the laundry room turned tattoo parlor, he pricked the tip of his finger with a needle he kept hidden under the stitching of his waistband. The wound was small, the blood quick. With a subtle movement, he dipped the tip of the tattoo needle into that crimson drop, letting it mix with the black ink pooled in a broken bottle cap. Then he worked, slowly and meticulously, dragging the needle across skin with practiced precision. He masked the ritual beneath routine. No one questioned the flick of his wrist or the slight pause before he began. They were too distracted by the art. He justified it in silence. The world had taken everything from him, his body, his freedom, his future. Now he would return the favor, drop by drop. There was no rage in it, no loud vengeance. Just a cold, methodical offering to a system that had chewed him up and spit him out. Each tattoo became a quiet act of war. Luther continued collecting payments. Packs of cigarettes, trays of food, handwritten favors. The more famous Jalen became inside the walls, the more Luther profited. He scheduled the appointments, kept a log and a stolen notebook, and charged extra for larger pieces. He never suspected. To him, Jalen was a broken boy with gifted hands and no voice to push back. As long as the ink kept flowing, Luther had no reason to look deeper. Over the next 4 months, Jalen tattooed more than 50 inmates. Some bore large, sprawling designs across their backs. Others requested small talismans inked over their hearts. One man cried when he saw the face of his murdered brother rendered in perfect grayscale on his shoulder. Another claimed his insomnia disappeared after getting a symbol of balance inked on his chest. The tattoos became sacred to some, believed to hold power, protection, or transformation. Word of the artist spread beyond D-Block. Even guards quietly discussed his talent during smoke breaks. Then came the sickness. At first, it was subtle, men feeling faint during yard time, persistent coughs, fevers that wouldn't break. Some attributed it to the food, others to mold in the vents. But when the symptoms persisted and more inmates began lining up at the infirmary with similar complaints, the prison medical staff initiated a round of tests. It started with 1 positive result, then 2, then 5. All HIV. All previously negative. Panic settled into the cell blocks like fog. Rumors swirled. Some suspected reused needles, a shared toothbrush, dirty razors. Others whispered about curses, karma, or divine punishment. But behind every story, there was one common thread. Every infected man had sat beneath Jalen's machine. Some inmates stayed quiet, ashamed, or afraid. Others grew paranoid, accusing each other, begging to be retested. The medical staff expanded their investigation, reviewing intake histories, contact records, and commissary logs. Names were compared. Timelines cross-referenced. The overlap was undeniable. The conclusion, however horrifying, began to take shape. One name floated to the surface again and again, not as a symptom, but as a source. Jalen Harper. The artist. The boy with the needle and the blood. The sudden surge in HIV cases within the confines of Millstone Correctional Facility did not go unnoticed. The prison infirmary, overwhelmed by the volume of new diagnoses, alerted the state's Department of Corrections Medical Oversight Board. What had initially been treated as isolated incidents now took on the dimensions of a public health crisis. In a tightly controlled population with no access to outside exposure, multiple infections within a narrow time frame demanded one conclusion: the source had to be internal. A formal investigation was launched. The facility's sanitation protocols were reviewed. Commissary records, hygiene inventories, and personal logs were examined. Inmate interviews were conducted in private, with some offering partial stories and others refusing to speak at all. The consistency among their accounts pointed to one recurring activity: tattoo sessions with Jalen Harper. Medical authorities and internal affairs officers seized Jalen's tattoo equipment for analysis. The makeshift machine, ink containers, and the tools used in each session were bagged and sent to the state crime lab. Jalen was summoned for questioning. He arrived in silence, hands cuffed, his expression unreadable. Seated across from investigators, he answered nothing. He kept his gaze fixed downward, unmoved by the accusations, unshaken by the silence in the room. The officers noted his lack of response, interpreting it as either trauma or indifference. Either way, it yielded nothing. Luther Scott was also brought in. As Jalen's handler and self-appointed manager, he was pressed for details. Luther denied any knowledge of unsafe practices. He claimed he never oversaw the hygiene of the sessions and that his role was limited to scheduling and managing requests. His demeanor was confident, but not confrontational. He stated repeatedly that he had no reason to suspect anything beyond artistic expression and denied having witnessed any bloodletting or suspicious activity. Security footage from the tattoo space offered no immediate answers. The area was poorly lit and monitored by a single overhead camera that caught mostly angles of inmates' backs. At first glance, nothing in the recordings suggested malpractice. But a recent audit had led to the installation of a secondary, discrete camera positioned behind a ventilation grate. It captured a clearer, sideward view of the workspace. Upon reviewing the newer footage, investigators observed a small but deliberate motion. Before each tattoo session, Jalen appeared to prick his finger, subtly, and hovered over the ink container. The gesture was quick, easy to miss. He then dipped the needle and began his work as usual. This pattern repeated across multiple recordings. The timing aligned with the window of initial infections. It was enough to warrant further analysis. The crime lab's examination of the equipment confirmed the presence of dried human blood on both the needle and ink residue. A mitochondrial DNA comparison was run. The result matched Jalen Harper. His blood was in the ink. With this evidence, the investigation shifted from internal review to criminal liability. Charges were expanded beyond regulatory violations. The case was elevated to federal jurisdiction due to the deliberate use of blood as a medium and the infectious consequences it caused. Now classified under statutes relating to bioterrorism and intentional harm within a state institution, Jalen's actions were no longer framed as negligence. They were viewed as calculated. Legal teams from both the Department of Justice and the state's Attorney General's office were brought in. The scope of the investigation widened to include the timeline of infections, the documented list of tattoo clients, and all communications tied to Jalen's sessions. Each infected inmate became a potential witness and victim in a federal case centered on deliberate viral transmission. Millstone went into lockdown. The tattoo space was dismantled. Jalen was moved to administrative segregation under constant surveillance. Word of the investigation spread through the prison like wildfire. Fear, shame, and anger filled the corridors. Some inmates demanded retaliation. Others retreated into silence, uncertain of what they carried inside their bodies. The prison system had birthed a crisis from within. And now, the full weight of the law prepared to respond. The trial began in the summer of 2017 under heightened security and growing public attention. Jalen Harper had been placed in solitary confinement months prior, his communication strictly limited and every movement monitored. The state's prosecution team, bolstered by federal representatives, brought a litany of serious charges: intentional exposure to HIV, aggravated assault with a deadly biological agent, and unlawful endangerment of a controlled population. The language used in the indictment reflected not only criminal responsibility but the weight of moral reckoning. His actions were not merely dangerous, they were portrayed as an act of deliberate contamination. Luther Scott faced his own charges in a separate proceeding: extortion, labor trafficking within a correctional institution, and aiding and abetting in the commission of a felony. The court ruled early on to separate their cases. Despite their linked histories, the state argued that their motivations and degrees of involvement diverged sharply enough to warrant individual trials. Luther pled not guilty, claiming ignorance of Jalen's methods and denying any knowledge of blood contamination. Jalen, meanwhile, refused to mount a defense. His court-appointed attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity and psychological trauma, but Jalen himself neither collaborated nor objected. He sat through every hearing motionless, his face unreadable, his gaze often lingering on the courtroom walls rather than the people around him. To some observers, he resembled more a painter contemplating an empty canvas than a defendant fighting for his freedom. He didn't acknowledge witnesses, didn't respond to testimony, and never took the stand. The prosecution, led by the state's Special Crimes Division, constructed a meticulous narrative. They presented a timeline of infections that corresponded with Jalen's tattoo appointments. Medical records showed that all affected inmates had previously tested negative. The introduction of HIV into their systems occurred within the same 4-month period, and all had received tattoos during that time. Surveillance footage was played for the court, showing Jalen's recurring finger-pricking ritual prior to sessions. Analysts testified about the biological traces found in the ink and on the needles. Forensic experts confirmed the presence of Jalen's blood and the match between the virus strains found in his blood and that of multiple infected inmates. One of the trial's most harrowing moments came when the families of the victims were invited to testify. Fathers, brothers, and sons, many of whom had served time for nonviolent offenses, were now facing chronic illness because of a decision they hadn't known they were part of. They sat in the courtroom holding framed photographs of their loved ones. Some cried. Others simply stared at Jaylen, hoping for a reaction. They got none. A key testimony came from the prison's psychiatric staff. A licensed clinical psychologist, who had evaluated Jaylen during his early incarceration, described him as suffering from profound post-traumatic stress disorder. The report detailed episodes of dissociation, persistent depressive symptoms, and signs of internalized shame. It painted a picture of a young man whose psyche had fractured under the pressure of systemic violence, betrayal, and forced dependency. The psychologist noted that Jaylen had never spoken about his assault directly but exhibited classic markers of unresolved trauma. Though this did not excuse his actions, it offered context for his silence and detachment. The courtroom remained tense throughout the proceedings. Reporters filled the benches. Activists outside argued for prison reform, while others called for maximum sentencing. The media dubbed Jaylen the Blood Artist, a label that blurred tragedy with spectacle. His lawyer, desperate to sway the jury toward leniency, emphasized Jaylen's age, his background, and the fact that his first experience with violence had occurred inside the very system meant to punish him. But it was not enough. After weeks of testimony, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. They returned 2 days later with a verdict. Jaylen was found guilty on all major counts. He showed no emotion when the decision was read. There was no visible reaction, no sigh, no tremor, not even a blink. He simply lowered his head, as if closing a chapter he had already finished writing. His case became a landmark in correctional law, setting precedent for how institutions monitor nontraditional vectors of disease transmission. The judgment against him reflected more than legal condemnation. It reflected the failure of an entire structure that had taken a boy and returned something else entirely. The sentence was final. Jaylen Harper was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court delivered its decision without hesitation, citing the premeditated nature of his actions and the irreversible harm caused to dozens of inmates. For the families of the infected, the ruling brought a sense of closure, but no true comfort. For the prison, it was a public reckoning. For Jaylen, it was silence. Luther Scott, convicted of financial exploitation and complicity, received a 20-year sentence. His defense had framed him as a bystander to a greater crime, a man blinded by profit rather than cruelty. The court acknowledged the distinction but saw no innocence in his role. He was led out in chains, expressionless, his grip on Millstone's underground hierarchy permanently severed. After the sentencing, Jaylen's behavior changed. He stopped speaking. He refused meals for days at a time, and when he did eat, it was mechanically, as if detached from the need itself. He declined all visitation, though few sought him out. He rejected offers to continue his tattoo work, left his materials untouched, and avoided even the recreation yard. Guards described him as a ghost, present but unresponsive, haunting his cell without sound. One correctional officer later reported that Jaylen would sit for hours on the lower bunk, unmoving, eyes fixed on a patch of peeling paint along the far wall. He rarely blinked. He wrote nothing, requested nothing, answered nothing. It was as if the trial had carved out the last piece of him that was still human, leaving only a frame behind. Days passed this way, then weeks. No outburst. No incident. Just stillness. Then, on an ordinary morning during a routine check, they found him. His body was suspended from the upper bed frame by a twisted bed sheet, knotted tightly around his neck. There were no signs of struggle. No marks beyond the ligature. His eyes were closed. The act had been clean, deliberate. In the pocket of his prison shirt was a folded scrap of paper with a message written in neat block letters. This was art. News of his suicide spread quickly through the facility. For some, it was a relief. For others, a provocation. Among the inmate population, debates erupted. Was it an admission of guilt, an act of defiance, or something more abstract? The phrase he left behind became a kind of puzzle. Rumors filled the gaps. Some inmates covered their tattoos with new ink, ashamed or afraid. Others began to flaunt them, claiming they carried meaning beyond the infection, a piece of something eternal, something unfinished. The administration sealed off Jalen's former cell, boxed up his possessions, and submitted them for evidence storage. Among his belongings was a thin, unmarked folder. Inside were dozens of drawings, precise, quiet pencil sketches on stolen sheets of notebook paper. Unlike his tattoos, these were soft, untouched by blood. They showed faces, hands, broken wings, bleeding hearts, but no names. No violence. Just images suspended in stillness, as if preserved from another world. Jalen's death was recorded, documented, and filed away. The prison returned to its routines. The investigation formally closed. No further charges were pursued. But within the walls of Millstone, his story lingered, in inked skin, in whispered conversations, in the space he left behind. Some believed he was mad. Others believed he was something closer to prophetic. In the end, his message remained the same, carved not in marble but in flesh. This was art. And like all art born of pain, it outlived its maker.